the divorce hearing, my husband arrived with the most expensive legal team money could buy, confident he would leave me with nothing. "You're finished," he laughed. I looked small and unprepared, but I had already made one quiet call. Moments later, the courtroom doors swung open. The most feared attorney in the state stepped inside, the son of my late housekeeper, whose education I had secretly paid for years ago. The judge went still. 20 minutes later, everything changed. Stay with me until the end, and tell me the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. My name is Sheila. I'm 63, and I truly believed I had already seen the worst people were capable of. I was wrong. That Tuesday morning in March, the courthouse on Main Street felt colder than usual. Every step echoed off the marble floors, and the scent of old wood and floor wax clung to the air. I sat on a hard oak bench outside courtroom B, hands folded neatly in my lap, watching the clock count down the final moments of my 41-year marriage. Across from me sat Tobias with his legal team 3 lawyers, each costing $500 an hour, something he made sure I knew. Their charcoal suits matched perfectly, and their briefcases probably cost more than my groceries for half a year. Beside me was my attorney, Mr. Peterson, a kind man in his 70s who charged far less and grew visibly tense every time he glanced at Tobias's army of confidence. "Ready for this, sweetheart?" Tobias called out, his voice coated in fake concern. The word he had used for decades now sounded like a taunt. "I hope you understand it's just business." I said nothing. For 8 months since the divorce papers arrived, he had been clear about his goal. He wanted everything. The house we lived in for 35 years, the business he built while I supported him in silence, even the small savings account I thought we shared, he intended to leave me with nothing. "Mrs. Henderson," the bailiff said gently, "Judge Morrison is ready for you." I stood on unsteady legs and smoothed my navy blue dress, the same one I had worn to Carmen's funeral 3 years earlier. Carmen wasn't just my housekeeper. She was the one person who truly knew me, the woman behind the polite smiles Tobias saw every day. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pale sunlight streamed through high windows, far too cheerful for what was about to unfold. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s, sat behind the bench, scanning documents. Tobias and his lawyers filled the left side of the room. Mr. Peterson and I looked small and outnumbered on the right. "This is a dissolution of marriage proceeding," the judge began. "Mr. Caldwell, you may present your case." Tobias's lead attorney stood with rehearsed precision. "Your Honor, my client seeks a fair division of marital assets. However, Mrs. Henderson contributed very little to their accumulation." The words landed hard. Very little, after decades of keeping a home, raising children, and standing behind my husband while setting aside my own dreams. "Mrs. Henderson was primarily a homemaker," he continued, flipping through his notes. "She holds no professional credentials, contributed no significant income, and made no documented financial contributions to an estate valued at approximately $850,000. That number echoed in my head. That was the price placed on our entire life together. "Therefore," he said, growing more confident, "we request that Mrs. Henderson receive only the minimum required by law, as she lacks the means to support herself independently." I felt Mr. Peterson shift beside me, his pen racing across the page. He was a good man, but we both knew he was outmatched. Judge Morrison looked at me, her expression softening for just a moment. "Mrs. Henderson, would you like to respond?" Mr. Peterson began to rise, but I gently placed my hand on his arm. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I would like to make a brief phone call before we continue. It's important." The judge frowned. "That's highly irregular." "I understand," I replied calmly, "but there's someone who needs to know what's happening here today." Tobias laughed loudly. "Who are you calling, Sheila? Your book club? Your knitting friends?" His lawyers laughed with him. "My wife has always been dramatic, Your Honor," Tobias added smoothly. "She probably just wants someone to hold her hand." The embarrassment burned, but I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded, reached into my purse, and made the call that would change everything. "May I make the call, Your Honor? It will only take a moment." Judge Morrison glanced at her watch. "5 minutes, Mrs. Henderson. Then we continue." I walked to the back of the courtroom, my heels echoing sharply against the marble floor. My phone felt unusually heavy as I scrolled through my contacts. When I finally found the name I was looking for, I hesitated for just a second before pressing call. It rang twice. Wesley Morrison Law Group. "Wesley," I said softly. "It's Sheila. I need you." There was a brief silence, and then his tone changed completely. "Aunt Sheila? What's wrong? Are you all right?" He had called me Aunt Sheila since he was 7, even though we weren't related by blood. "I'm at the downtown courthouse, courtroom B," I said. "The divorce hearing. He's trying to take everything." Another pause, longer this time. When Wesley spoke again, his voice was calm, firm, unshakable. "I'll be right there." I ended the call and returned to my seat. Tobias was still smiling, leaning toward his lawyers and whispering something that made them laugh. Mr. Peterson looked at me with quiet concern. "Who did you call?" he murmured. "A friend," I replied. Judge Morrison resumed the session. "Mr. Peterson, your response to Mr. Caldwell's arguments?" Mr. Peterson stood, his hands trembling just slightly. "Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson devoted over 40 years to her family. While her contributions may not appear on financial records, they were essential to the success of both the marriage and Mr. Henderson's business." Tobias rolled his eyes. Caldwell rose immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. Emotional statements don't change financial reality. Mrs. Henderson lacks the education, experience, and capacity to manage significant assets. A modest settlement is appropriate, given her limited contribution." Limited contribution? The phrase echoed in my mind as memories flooded in nights spent caring for sick children while Tobias was away, dinners prepared for his clients, celebrations organized for his success, dreams of my own quietly set aside. Caldwell continued smoothly. "Additionally, Mrs. Henderson has demonstrated poor financial understanding throughout the marriage. She has no background in investments or business operations. Awarding her substantial assets would be irresponsible." Tobias leaned back, completely at ease. He met my eyes and smiled, not the warm smile I once knew, but something sharp and satisfied. "You know what, Sheila?" he said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "You should be thankful for whatever you get. You've never been more than a housewife. You don't know how to take care of yourself, let alone money. You're nobody." The words struck the room like a sudden chill. Judge Morrison frowned, but Tobias didn't stop. "You're nobody," he repeated more quietly, somehow even colder. "Always have been. I don't know why I stayed married to you so long." Something inside me finally let go. Not my strength, that had been tested and rebuilt many times, but the last fragile thread tying me to the man I once believed loved me. I looked at Tobias, surrounded by confidence and expensive suits, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. He had no idea who I truly was, no idea what I had been quietly doing all these years while he dismissed me as insignificant. The courtroom doors were thick oak, and when they opened, the sound rolled through the room like distant thunder. Every head turned. Even Judge Morrison looked up. My phone buzzed. I glanced down and smiled for the first time in months. "I'm here. W." Tobias was still laughing, unaware that his certainty was about to crumble. He believed he had accounted for every detail, every weakness. But there were parts of my life he had never seen. Choices I had made quietly, promises I had kept. Sometimes the doors open wider, and you hear footsteps in the hallway, steady, confident steps belonging to someone who had never been told he was nobody, someone I had made sure of that. As the footsteps drew closer, my thoughts drifted back to another courtroom, many years earlier. It was 1995. I was 35 and overwhelmed, managing a home and young children while Tobias traveled endlessly for work. That was where I first met Carmen Morales. She was 23, standing in family court, holding the hand of her 5-year-old son, Wesley. She was there to help translate for her elderly neighbor in a housing dispute. Despite her nerves, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, her simple blue dress carefully mended at the hem. Wesley stood beside her, silent and observant, his eyes sharp with a kind of intelligence you notice immediately. During a break, I approached her. "Excuse me," I said gently. "I couldn't help noticing how well you handled yourself. Are you looking for work?" Her English was hesitant back then, but her eyes filled with hope. "Yes. I clean houses, I cook, I take very good care." That was how it all began. Carmen started working for us 3 days a week, and during school holidays or sick days she brought Wesley with her. Tobias barely registered their presence. To him, they were just part of the background, another system quietly keeping his life comfortable while he focused on what he believed truly mattered. I noticed everything. I noticed how Carmen fixed small things around the house without ever being asked. Things Tobias never even realized were broken. I noticed how she placed fresh flowers on the dining table, not because it was her job, but because she understood that small moments of beauty made a home feel alive. And most of all, I noticed Wesley. Even at 5 years old, he was different. While other children played with toys, Wesley sat at the kitchen table copying letters from my old recipe cards, teaching himself to read in English. When Carmen worked late, I helped him with homework, watching his eyes brighten every time something finally made sense. "He is very smart," Carmen would say, her voice filled with pride but also worry. "Too smart for our neighborhood. I want better for him." She never finished the thought, but she didn't need to. I understood. Carmen cleaned houses during the week and worked in a factory on weekends. Wesley's father had disappeared before he was born. There was no money for the kind of education that could open the doors his mind deserved. That's when I began to plan. At first, it was subtle. I bought extra school supplies and casually suggested Wesley use them for projects. I signed him up for the library's summer reading program and drove him there myself when Carmen was working. When he needed a new backpack, I bought one for him, one for my own son, and said I'd gotten a discount for buying both. Tobias never noticed the extra spending. By then, he was earning well, and I had always managed the household carefully. A few dollars for notebooks, library fees, or an occasional treat blended invisibly into the larger budget. As Wesley grew older, my planning became more intentional. I opened a separate savings account under my maiden name. Every week, I set aside $20 or $30 from grocery money. Over time, it added up. By the time Wesley reached middle school, there was nearly $15,000 in that account. That was when Carmen got sick. It started with exhaustion she blamed on working too much. Then came headaches, unexplained weight loss, bruises that didn't heal. By the time she finally saw a doctor, the illness had already spread. I drove her to every appointment, sitting beside her in quiet, sterile waiting rooms as test after test was done. Tobias never asked where I went on those afternoons. As long as dinner was ready when he came home, my time was my problem. "I'm scared for Wesley," Carmen whispered one day at the oncology center. "If something happens to me, he has no one. My family in Mexico can't take him. He's so close to finishing high school." I took her hand, shocked by how thin it had become. "Nothing is going to happen to you," I said gently. "And even if it does, Wesley will be okay, I promise." I meant it. The treatments were harsh and costly. Carmen's insurance covered some, but far from all. Quietly, I paid what insurance wouldn't, using money from my hidden account and telling Carmen it was help from the church. She was too proud to accept personal charity, but she trusted what she believed was community support. While Carmen fought for her life, Wesley flourished. His grades were perfect. Teachers spoke of him with awe. College acceptance letters began arriving, but college required money Carmen didn't have and couldn't borrow. That was when I made the hardest decision of my life. For years, I had planned to use my savings to finally take art classes. It was a dream I had carried since I was young, postponed again and again for Tobias's career, for the children, for everyone else. That money was supposed to be for me. Instead, I gave it to Wesley. I created a scholarship through a fictional foundation, complete with official-looking paperwork typed on Tobias's office computer. To Carmen and Wesley, it appeared that an anonymous donor had recognized his talent and wanted to invest in his future. $1,200 a month, I told them. Enough for tuition, books, and living expenses at the state university. Carmen cried when she saw the documents. Wesley hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. They called it a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was sacrifice. It was 40 years of saving grocery money dollar by dollar. It was art classes I would never take, comforts I would never choose for myself, dreams I set aside one final time. But watching Wesley graduate as valedictorian, seeing him walk across that stage with tears of joy in his eyes, knowing his future was wide open, that mattered more than any dream I had given up. Carmen lived long enough to see him start college, but not long enough to see him finish. She passed away 2 years later, on a cold December morning, while I held her hand in the hospital. "Take care of him," she whispered. "He loves you like a mother." "I will," I promised. And I did. I kept every promise the same way I always had, quietly, completely, without expecting recognition. After his mother's passing, Wesley threw himself into his studies. He changed his major to law, driven by a fierce desire to protect people like Carmen, people without a voice. I continued sending the monthly scholarship payments, and he continued believing they came from an anonymous foundation. During law school, he often called me late at night, stressed about exams or uncertain about the future. He never called me Sheila in those moments, always Aunt Sheila, the name he gave me when he was 7. "I'm going to make you proud," he'd say. "I'm going to make Mom proud. I'm going to be somebody who helps people the way you both helped me." "You already make us proud," I would tell him. "You always have." By the time Wesley passed the bar exam and opened his own law practice, I had spent nearly $45,000 on his education. Tobias never noticed. Why would he? He was too busy building his own empire to notice his wife's quiet, careful acts of resistance. Wesley's law practice expanded faster than anyone expected. He became known for taking cases others avoided, for standing his ground, for pushing harder the moment things grew difficult. Within 5 years, he was one of the most respected attorneys in the state, and through all of it, he still called me Aunt Sheila. 3 years ago, 8 months after Carmen passed, and just as Wesley's name was gaining real weight in legal circles, Tobias first mentioned divorce. At first, it sounded harmless jokes about how simple life would be without a wife to consider, comments about feeling young and carefree when he traveled. That was when I began keeping records. I noted every cruel remark, every dismissive look, every moment he made me feel invisible. I photographed the bruises on my arms from the times his grip was too tight when anger took over. I saved emails where he spoke about me to business partners as if I were an object he'd grown tired of. I did it quietly, the way I had done everything else in my life. I kept it all in a folder hidden behind my recipe cards in the kitchen, the same place where Wesley once practiced writing his letters. Carmen had taught me that love wasn't only sacrifice, it was also foresight. It was planting seeds long before you knew how they would grow. Now, sitting in that courtroom while my husband called me nobody, I could feel those seeds beginning to bear fruit. The footsteps in the hallway stopped. Someone was standing just outside the doors. Tobias was still laughing with his lawyers, completely sure of his victory. He had no idea that the shy 5-year-old boy who once sat at my kitchen table had grown into the one attorney in this state no one wanted to face. He had no idea that every dollar he thought I had wasted on household expenses had actually been an investment in this exact moment, and most of all, he had no idea that real love, the kind that asks for nothing in return, always finds a way to protect what matters. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom B swung open, the sound cutting cleanly through the room. Every conversation stopped. Wesley Morrison stepped inside, and everything shifted. He was 38 now, tall and commanding in a charcoal gray suit that fit perfectly. His shoes were polished, his posture calm and assured, the kind of presence that comes from knowing exactly who you are. But it was his eyes that caught me. The same sharp, thoughtful eyes I remembered from years ago, now steady, confident, and powerful. 2 associates followed him, moving with quiet precision, briefcases and tablets ready. Judge Morrison looked up, clearly surprised. "Excuse me, this is a closed proceeding. Are you counsel in this case?" Wesley's voice filled the courtroom, calm, controlled, unmistakable. "Yes, Your Honor. Wesley Morrison, Morrison Law Group. I'm here to represent Mrs. Sheila Henderson." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Peterson stared at me in disbelief. Tobias's smile vanished, replaced by something closer to panic. His legal team suddenly looked far less impressive, but Tobias's reaction was the most telling. The color drained from his face as recognition set in. His hands tightened on the table. "Wesley," he whispered. "Carmen's boy." Wesley met his gaze without emotion. "Mr. Henderson, it's been a long time." Judge Morrison glanced between us. "Mr. Morrison, I wasn't aware Mrs. Henderson had retained new counsel. Mr. Peterson, were you informed of this change?" Mr. Peterson shook his head slowly. "No, Your Honor, this is news to me." I stood, feeling stronger than I had in months. "Your Honor, I'd like to dismiss Mr. Peterson and formally retain Mr. Morrison. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for your work." Mr. Peterson gathered his papers, relief clear on his face. As he stood to leave, he leaned close and whispered, "Good luck, Sheila. Something tells me you won't need it." And for the first time in a very long while, I knew that was true. Wesley moved toward the defense table with his associates, setting their briefcases down with practiced precision. As he drew closer, Tobias's confidence visibly cracked. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline despite the cool air, and his breathing grew quick and uneven. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, rising again, though his voice lacked the sharp edge it had earlier. "We object to this last-minute change in counsel. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to disrupt the proceedings." Wesley turned to him calmly, offering a smile that carried no warmth. "Mr. Caldwell, isn't it? I'm familiar with your work. Mostly cases where pressure is used to push women into settling for less than they deserve. Has that strategy been working well for you lately?" Caldwell's face tightened. "Your Honor, this is inappropriate." Judge Morrison raised her hand. "That's enough. Mr. Morrison, your entrance was memorable. But Mrs. Henderson has the right to retain you if she chooses. Are you prepared to proceed immediately? We've already heard opening arguments." Wesley opened his briefcase without haste. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been following this case since it was filed 8 months ago. I'm fully prepared." 8 months! He had been watching all along, waiting. A rush of emotion moved through me, gratitude, disbelief, and a deep aching pride I hadn't felt in years. Tobias leaned forward, his voice sharp with panic. "This doesn't make sense. How can you afford him, Sheila? Wesley Morrison charges $5,000 an hour. You don't have that kind of money." Wesley turned to Tobias, his voice steady and resonant. "Mr. Henderson, there are things money can't measure. There are debts that can't be repaid with cash. And there are women who deserve far more respect than being dismissed as nobody by the man who vowed to stand beside them." The courtroom went silent. Tobias stared at him as if confronting a living reminder of everything he had ignored, every kindness overlooked, every sacrifice minimized. "You don't understand," Tobias said, desperation creeping into his tone. "She's lived off my success for 40 years. She didn't build anything. She doesn't deserve half of what I earned." Wesley's associate handed him a tablet. He glanced at it, then looked back at Tobias with calm curiosity. "That's interesting, Mr. Henderson, because the financial records we've reviewed suggest your wife made substantial contributions, ones you were apparently unaware of." Caldwell jumped up. "Objection. What records? We've seen nothing in discovery to support that claim." Wesley smiled again, measured and deliberate. "Discovery works both ways, Mr. Caldwell. While you were focused on proving Mrs. Henderson contributed nothing, we were documenting exactly how much she did." He nodded to his associate, who quickly set up a laptop and projector. In moments, the courtroom transformed into a presentation space. "With the court's permission," Wesley said, I'd like to present evidence that reframes Mrs. Henderson's role in this marriage. Judge Morrison leaned forward. Proceed. The first image appeared on the wall, a photo of our house on Elm Street taken 35 years ago. Small, faded, overgrown. This property was purchased in 1988 for $89,000, Wesley explained. $18,000 down, the rest financed. The next image showed the same house today. Polished, landscaped, and welcoming. Current value, $350,000. Tobias's financial statements credited market growth and his own efforts. Wesley clicked to the next slide, revealing a detailed timeline of renovations. Our findings show that Mrs. Henderson managed nearly every improvement. She researched contractors, negotiated costs, supervised work, and often completed the labor herself. Memories flooded back-painting walls while Tobias played golf, researching appliances late at night, shaping the garden by hand. Additionally, Wesley continued, her disciplined budgeting saved an estimated $2,000 to $3,000 annually, funds reinvested into the home and Mr. Henderson's business. That's not true, Tobias snapped. I earned everything. She just spent my money. Wesley faced him directly. Mr. Henderson, do you remember 1993, when your business was struggling and you were 3 months behind on commercial rent? The question hung in the air, and for the first time, Tobias had no immediate answer. Tobias's face drained of color. That was different, he said weakly. That was just a rough patch. Indeed, Wesley replied calmly. A rough patch that would have ended your business entirely if Mrs. Henderson hadn't stepped in. He clicked to the next slide. For 6 months, Mrs. Henderson worked a part-time job at a grocery store, nights and weekends, earning $8 an hour. During that same period, she continued to run the household and care for 2 young children. Every dollar she earned went directly to keeping Mr. Henderson's business afloat. I felt my breath catch. I had almost forgotten those months. Wesley would have been only 8 years old then, but Carmen had watched my children while I worked late shifts. Somehow, he remembered more than I ever realized. The screen filled with old bank statements, clear deposits, clear dates. $2,400, Wesley said evenly. That is how much Mrs. Henderson earned during those 6 months. Without her intervention, there would be no business to divide today. Caldwell scribbled notes furiously, but his shoulders had slumped. This was not the story they had prepared for. This pattern continued throughout the 41 years of the marriage, Wesley went on. Mrs. Henderson was not simply maintaining a household. She was the silent partner who made her husband's success possible. Slide after slide appeared, records I didn't even know existed, documentation of dinners I had organized for Tobias's clients, proof that I had filled in as his secretary when he couldn't afford staff, notes showing how relationships I built within social circles had led directly to major contracts. Then the final slide appeared, and my heart stopped. It was a photo of Wesley's college graduation. He stood beside me, both of us smiling, frozen in a moment I had never expected anyone else to see. Beneath the image was a financial breakdown. Your Honor, Wesley said, his voice softer now, I want the court to understand something about the woman before you. Mrs. Henderson didn't only contribute to her own family. For 15 years she contributed to mine. The courtroom was utterly still. She used money saved through careful household management to pay for my education, he continued. $1,200 a month for 4 years of undergraduate study, then $1,500 a month for 3 years of law school. She did this quietly, without recognition, asking nothing in return except that I work hard and become someone who could help others. Tobias stared in disbelief. In 41 years of marriage, he had never known about the savings account, never known about the scholarship. The total amount Mrs. Henderson invested in my education was $45,600, Wesley said. Money she could have used for her own dreams, her own future. Instead, she chose to believe in a young boy and give him opportunities that didn't exist before she stepped in. Wesley turned to Tobias, his voice steady and unyielding. So when you claim Mrs. Henderson contributed nothing meaningful, I disagree. She helped raise me, and now I'm here to ensure she receives everything she deserves." The only sound was Tobias's uneven breathing. He looked like a man watching the ground disappear beneath his feet. Judge Morrison leaned back slowly, absorbing everything. "This is compelling, Mr. Morrison. Do you have further evidence?" Wesley's expression sharpened. "Your Honor, we're just beginning." He moved toward the center of the courtroom with calm certainty, like someone who knew there was nowhere left to run. "What we've presented so far reflects only documented financial contributions," he said. "There is another category of evidence that is even more significant." He nodded to his associate, who immediately handed folders to the judge, to Caldwell, and to the court reporter. "For more than 15 years," Wesley continued, "Mrs. Henderson documented a consistent pattern of conduct that goes far beyond the normal breakdown of a marriage. What emerges is a clear effort by Mr. Henderson to undermine her confidence, limit her independence, and maintain control by keeping her financially dependent." Tobias leapt to his feet. "That's a lie. I never mistreated anyone. This is an attack on my character." "Mr. Henderson," Judge Morrison said sharply, "you will remain seated. One more interruption and I will hold you in contempt." He dropped back into his chair, breathing fast, while Caldwell gripped his arm and whispered urgently. Wesley opened his own folder. Inside were photographs, emails, handwritten notes. "Mrs. Henderson began keeping these records in 2008, Wesley explained. "At first she believed she was documenting possible health concerns. She was worried about changes in her husband's behavior and his sudden denial of conversations and commitments they had clearly discussed." He looked up. What she was actually documenting was something far more serious. "I remembered those early days when I first started keeping records. At the time, I truly believed Tobias might be developing some kind of cognitive problem. The man I was living with felt so different from the man I had married. It took me years to understand the truth. He hadn't changed. I had simply stopped excusing behavior that never should have been excused." "What Mrs. Henderson actually documented," Wesley continued calmly, "was a deliberate pattern of psychological manipulation meant to make her doubt her memory, her value, and her ability to function independently." The first image appeared on the screen. A photograph I had taken with a disposable camera, bruises on my upper arm, clearly shaped like fingerprints. "This photo was taken on March 15, 2009, Wesley said evenly, after Mr. Henderson grabbed Mrs. Henderson hard enough to leave marks. His reason was that she embarrassed him at a business dinner by expressing a political opinion that differed from his own." A strained sound escaped Tobias's throat, but Caldwell quickly pulled him back into his seat. "Mrs. Henderson's notes from that evening," Wesley went on, "state that Mr. Henderson told her she had no right to speak on subjects she didn't understand, and that her role at these events was to look pleasant and remain silent." The next image appeared, a screenshot of text messages. This exchange from June 2010 shows Mr. Henderson criticizing his wife for spending $12 on groceries he considered unnecessary, despite the fact that his business earned over $60,000 that same month. Judge Morrison read carefully, her expression tightening with every line. "The behavior escalated," Wesley said. "By 2012, Mr. Henderson required Mrs. Henderson to ask permission for any purchase over $5, while simultaneously criticizing her for not contributing income to the household." His associate handed him a thick stack of printed emails. These messages were sent by Mr. Henderson to his business partners between 2013 and 2018. In them, he repeatedly refers to his wife as a burden, questions her intelligence, and jokes about how easy it would be to leave her if the law made it simpler. Caldwell's pen moved rapidly, but his shoulders had slumped. Everything was dated, documented, and undeniable. "Your Honor," Caldwell said quickly, "these emails are taken out of context. People sometimes vent privately. That doesn't prove wrongdoing." Wesley turned toward him with calm patience. "You're correct, Mr. Caldwell. People do complain. What makes this different is consistency." The next slide showed a 10-year timeline filled with red markers. This isn't occasional frustration. It's a sustained effort to isolate Mrs. Henderson from confidence, opportunity, and independence. He clicked through example after example. 2011. Mrs. Henderson enrolled in a watercolor class at the community college. Mr. Henderson scheduled mandatory business dinners on class nights until she was forced to drop the course. Click. 2014. She was offered a part-time position at the local library. Mr. Henderson convinced her the pay was embarrassing and that working would mean neglecting her responsibilities at home. Click. 2016. She joined a monthly book club. Mr. Henderson complained so consistently about the time it took that she stopped attending after 4 months. Individually, each incident sounded small. Together, they formed a pattern that made my chest tighten. I had lived through all of it, yet I had never seen it so clearly until that moment. The objective, Wesley said, was to keep Mrs. Henderson financially and emotionally dependent, making it increasingly difficult for her to leave. Judge Morrison looked up from the documents. Mr. Morrison, this is concerning, but explain how it directly affects the financial division in this case. Wesley nodded. I'm glad you asked, Your Honor, because Mr. Henderson's behavior wasn't only harmful, it also violated financial disclosure requirements. The next slide appeared, and my breath caught. Bank records, multiple accounts, all in Tobias's name alone, balances far larger than anything I had ever known existed. While Mr. Henderson was restricting his wife's access to household funds and urging extreme caution with spending, Wesley said, he was quietly transferring marital assets into accounts she was never told about. Caldwell shot to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. These records were never disclosed. How did opposing counsel obtain confidential banking information? Wesley's expression remained calm, almost gentle. Through lawful means, Mr. Caldwell, he said, means that will be very clear once we finish. Mr. Caldwell, Wesley said evenly, these records were obtained through lawful subpoenas issued to the banks after we identified the accounts through Mr. Henderson's own emails. As it turns out, joking and writing about hiding money creates what attorneys refer to as evidence. The color drained from Tobias's face. Over the past 8 years, Wesley continued, Mr. Henderson transferred approximately $230,000 in marital funds into personal accounts, funds that should have been available for shared expenses, joint planning, and Mrs. Henderson's personal use. $230,000. My head spun as I thought about all those years of counting grocery money, of asking permission for small purchases, while Tobias quietly set aside a fortune that belonged to both of us. And that's not all, Wesley said, his voice gaining momentum. Mr. Henderson used this concealed money to support a lifestyle his wife was excluded from. Trips labeled as business that were personal getaways, high-end restaurants where he entertained clients alone, a luxury vehicle claimed as a business necessity, kept registered to his company and never brought home. The screen filled with charts and tables, every hidden account, every transfer, every diverted dollar laid out with precise clarity. The total value of assets Mr. Henderson attempted to conceal from this court is $473,000, Wesley said. Combined with the openly disclosed marital assets of $850,000, the total estate exceeds $1.3 million. I had spent decades living carefully beside a man who was, in truth, far wealthier than I ever knew. Tobias was breathing rapidly now, his confidence gone. His attorneys looked lost as their strategy collapsed. Caldwell flipped through papers, grasping for something, anything, to regain control. Your Honor, Caldwell said tightly, even if these claims are accurate, Mrs. Henderson lacks the experience to manage substantial assets. A limited settlement would better ensure her stability. The tone made my jaw clench, but Wesley only smiled. That raises an important point, Mr. Caldwell, he said calmly. Mrs. Henderson's financial abilities. He accepted another folder from his associate. For the past 15 years, Wesley continued. Mrs. Henderson has managed a sophisticated financial portfolio without her husband's knowledge or assistance. She opened independent investment accounts, researched and selected funds, and achieved an average annual return of 7.4%. A new chart appeared, showing the growth of the education fund I had built for Wesley from modest weekly deposits to its final balance. She turned $35,000 of household savings into $45,600, enough to fund both college and law school. Wesley looked directly at Caldwell. So when you suggest she's incapable of handling financial responsibility, I have to ask, what evidence supports that? Because what I see is a woman who managed complex finances successfully while her husband concealed assets and misrepresented their true financial situation. The courtroom was silent except for Tobias's uneven breathing. His lawyers had stopped writing. There was nothing left to argue. Judge Morrison leaned back, visibly absorbing everything. Mr. Morrison, do you have recommendations for how the court should proceed? Wesley adjusted his tie, composed and confident. Yes, Your Honor. Given the documented financial deception, the pattern of control, and the attempt to hide marital assets, we recommend that Mrs. Henderson receive 65% of all marital property, including the concealed accounts. We further recommend spousal support of $3,000 per month for 10 years, and that Mr. Henderson be responsible for all legal fees and court costs. Tobias let out a broken sound. Caldwell looked unsteady. And finally, Wesley added, we request a protective order requiring Mr. Henderson to maintain distance and cease all contact or attempts at intimidation. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. I will need time to review this evidence. This matter is continued for 2 weeks. As she gathered her papers, Wesley turned to Tobias one last time. You called her nobody, he said quietly. But you were wrong. She was never nobody. She was the woman who taught a frightened little boy to believe in himself. She was the woman who saved your business when you were too proud to admit it was failing. She was the woman who turned a simple house into a home while you were too distracted to notice. Wesley's voice grew firmer, more certain. And now she's the woman who will walk out of this courtroom with everything she has earned while you finally learn what it means to lose what you took for granted. The room was silent. The weight of it all settled heavily over everyone present. Tobias sat slumped in his chair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, surrounded by expensive lawyers who suddenly seemed powerless in the face of the truth. As I watched Wesley close his briefcase and prepare to leave, I understood that this was never really about money or payback. It was about a frightened 5-year-old boy who grew up into a man determined to never let the woman who believed in him be dismissed as insignificant. And it was about a 63-year-old woman who was finally about to discover who she could be when she was free to live as herself. The next 2 weeks passed slowly, like a quiet storm rumbling beneath the surface. Each day brought new ripples from what had happened in that courtroom. Word spread, whispers followed. Tobias had always guarded his image carefully, but now that image was cracking, piece by piece. During that time, I stayed in a small apartment Wesley arranged for me, away from the house on Elm Street where Tobias remained. It wasn't luxurious, but it was peaceful. Sunlight filled the rooms in the morning, and I could make my own coffee without asking permission. For the first time in decades, I woke up without the familiar knot of worry in my chest. I hadn't realized how heavy it had been until it was gone. Wesley called every evening, checking on me and preparing for what he called the final phase. One night his voice sounded different, careful, almost hesitant. Aunt Sheila, he said, there's something else we need to talk about. Something I found that even I wasn't expecting. My heart skipped. What is it? There was a long pause. It's about Tobias's business. The one you helped keep alive back in 1993. I went deeper into the records, and what I found changes everything. I sat down at the small kitchen table. What do you mean? That business was never legally his alone, Wesley said. When you put your grocery store earnings into it, you should have been made a partner. Instead, Tobias filed paperwork making it solely his without your knowledge. I gripped the phone. I don't understand. What does that mean? It means he took something that legally belonged to you, Wesley said calmly. Not just emotionally, on paper, a business that's now worth over $600,000. The number felt unreal. But how can you prove that? I asked. Because you kept records, he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. Those deposit slips you saved? They show direct investment during the company's most critical period. Combined with witness statements, we can establish that you were a partner who was intentionally excluded. Memories flooded back long shifts at the grocery store, coming home exhausted to find Tobias overwhelmed and angry, helping him organize paperwork, suggesting cost-saving ideas, making calls when he couldn't bring himself to. I had thought I was just being supportive. Now I understood. I had been an unpaid partner. What happens now? I asked quietly. Now we finish this, Wesley said. Tomorrow he's going to learn that calling you nobody was the most expensive mistake he ever made. The next morning, I dressed in a navy blue suit Wesley had insisted on buying for me. You need to look like the businesswoman you always were, he'd said, even if no one acknowledged it back then. When I entered courtroom B, everything felt different. The same benches, the same windows, the same scent of polished wood, but I wasn't the woman who had sat there trembling weeks before. I walked in with my head held high, Wesley and his team beside me, steady and assured. Tobias looked worn down. He had lost weight, his suit hung loosely, and dark circles framed his eyes. His lawyers hovered close, but their posture told the truth. They already knew how this would end. Judge Morrison entered promptly, carrying a thick folder. I've reviewed all submitted evidence, she said. This case represents some of the most serious financial deception and emotional harm I've seen in 20 years on the bench. She looked directly at Tobias. The court finds that you concealed assets, misrepresented your financial position, and repeatedly acted in bad faith. His hands shook slightly on the table. And, she continued, additional evidence presented by Mr. Morrison takes this matter even further. Wesley stood smoothly. Thank you, Your Honor. Over the past 2 weeks, our investigation uncovered evidence of what can only be described as long-term business misconduct, spanning more than 3 decades. Wesley nodded to his associates, who set up their presentation with effortless precision. We've determined that Mr. Henderson has been operating his construction company under false assumptions since 1993, the very year Mrs. Henderson's personal funds kept it from collapsing. The first slide displayed copies of my old bank statements. Deposits from my grocery store job were clearly highlighted, followed by withdrawals that lined up exactly with emergency payments made to keep Tobias's company running. Mrs. Henderson invested $2,400 of her own earnings into Henderson Construction Services at a time when the business had negative cash flow and was 3 months behind on rent, Wesley explained. That investment represented 37% of the company's total value at the time. He clicked to the next slide. Documents I had never seen before appeared on the wall. When Mr. Henderson reorganized the business after receiving this money, Wesley continued, he listed himself as the sole owner. Mrs. Henderson's contribution was never acknowledged, and she was never granted the partnership she had earned. Caldwell rose weakly. Objection, Your Honor. This was a spousal gift. Supporting a spouse doesn't establish ownership. Wesley turned to him calmly. That would be true, Mr. Caldwell, if this had been a gift, but Mrs. Henderson's own words from that period tell a very different story. The next image appeared, a photocopy of a handwritten letter I had forgotten existed. This is a letter Mrs. Henderson wrote to her sister in October 1993, Wesley said. In it, she states, I'm putting my grocery store money into Tobias's company as an investment. He promised that once things improve, I'll be made a partner so I can help run things. I'm tired of watching the same mistakes repeat. I remembered writing it. I remembered the hope. And I remembered how that promise quietly disappeared once the business recovered. Additionally, Wesley went on, we have testimony from 3 former employees who confirm Mrs. Henderson's active involvement throughout the 1990s. She handled client communication, managed bookkeeping during peak periods, and even supervised job sites when Mr. Henderson was stretched thin. With every word, Tobias sank further into his chair. The current value of Henderson Construction Services is approximately $600,000, Wesley said. Based on her original investment and sustained involvement, Mrs. Henderson is entitled to 37% ownership. 37%, $222,000, a share of something I had helped build and never knew was mine. But Wesley wasn't finished. "There's one more issue the court needs to address," he said. "Our investigation revealed that Mr. Henderson used company funds for personal purposes, including hiring a private investigator to monitor Mrs. Henderson during their separation." A chill ran through me. "These surveillance reports," Wesley continued, "paid for with money belonging to both spouses, show that Mrs. Henderson spent her time grocery shopping, visiting the library, and attending church. In other words, Mr. Henderson used shared funds to confirm that his wife was exactly who she appeared to be. The irony was painful. The total amount spent on this surveillance was $8,700, Wesley said, funds taken directly from a business Mrs. Henderson unknowingly co-owned for 30 years. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her voice firm. "Mr. Henderson, do you wish to respond?" For a moment, Tobias stayed silent. Then he stood, brushing off Caldwell's attempt to stop him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unsteady, "I never meant for things to get this far. I thought she'd be grateful for what I provided. I thought she understood that I made the important decisions." He looked at me then, really looked at me. "Sheila, I was protecting you. You were never meant for business. You weren't strong enough for that kind of responsibility. The woman I used to be might have believed him, might have shrunk again, but the woman standing there now had spent 2 weeks remembering who she was before she learned to make herself smaller to survive." "Your Honor," I said, rising to my feet with a steadiness that surprised even me. "I'd like to respond to that," I said. Judge Morrison nodded. "Go ahead, Mrs. Henderson." I looked straight at Tobias, really seeing him for the first time in decades. "Tobias, you're right about one thing," I said calmly. "I was never suited for the kind of business you practiced, the kind built on deception, secrecy, and treating the people who love you as disposable." My voice grew steadier with every word. "But I was always strong enough to carry responsibility. I carried the responsibility of holding our family together while you chased your ambitions. I carried the responsibility of supporting your dreams while putting my own on hold, and I carried the responsibility of investing in a young man's future, asking for nothing in return except the knowledge that I had done what was right." I gestured toward Wesley, who was watching me with quiet pride. That investment taught me what real strength actually is. Real strength isn't about control. It isn't about making someone else feel small so you can feel important. Real strength is lifting others up and trusting that, when it truly matters, kindness will be remembered. I sat down, my heart racing, but my mind clear. Tobias stared at me like I was a stranger. In many ways, I was. Judge Morrison reviewed her notes one final time before speaking. "Based on the evidence presented," she said firmly, "this court finds that Mr. Henderson engaged in long-term financial deception, emotional manipulation, and business fraud." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Mrs. Henderson is awarded 65% of all acknowledged marital assets, as well as 37% ownership of Henderson Construction Services. Mr. Henderson will also provide spousal support of $4,000 per month for 12 years and will be responsible for all legal fees and court costs." The numbers echoed in my mind, overwhelming and unreal. "And finally," Judge Morrison added, "a restraining order is issued. Mr. Henderson will maintain a minimum distance of 500 feet from Mrs. Henderson at all times." Tobias collapsed back into his chair, stunned. His lawyers whispered urgently, already calculating losses. But my thoughts weren't on the money. They were on that old letter Wesley had shown, the one where I wrote about wanting a voice, wanting to be an equal. For 30 years, I had accepted silence. Now, finally, I had been heard. As the court was dismissed and people began filing out, Wesley came to my side, smiling brighter than I had ever seen him. "How do you feel, Aunt Sheila?" he asked. I thought carefully before answering. "Relieved," I said. "Vindicated, yes, but more than anything, free. Like I'm finally ready to find out who I am when no one is trying to convince me I'm nothing." He laughed softly and offered his arm. "Then let's go find that out together." As we walked out of the courtroom, Tobias's voice drifted behind us, arguing desperately about appeals and technicalities. It sounded distant, like noise from a life I had already left behind. The courthouse steps were flooded with afternoon sunlight. For the first time in 41 years, I walked down them as my own woman. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a small cottage with a wraparound porch and a garden I was slowly restoring. Morning light poured through windows I had chosen myself. The walls were painted soft yellow because it made me happy, and I no longer needed permission to choose joy. The cottage was smaller than the house on Elm Street, but it was entirely mine. Every chair, every picture, every plant existed there because I wanted it. The kitchen was my favorite room. Open shelves held colorful dishes I'd collected recently, and a small breakfast nook overlooked the backyard where birds gathered each morning. That morning was special. Wesley was coming for Sunday breakfast, a tradition we'd started after everything was finalized. He always arrived right on time, carrying flowers from the market and a newspaper he thought I'd enjoy. I was pulling blueberry muffins from the oven when I heard his car. Through the window, I watched him walk up the garden path, and my heart filled with the same fierce pride I'd felt seeing him stand in that courtroom months earlier. He looked confident and successful in his casual clothes, but when he smiled through the glass, I still saw the thoughtful little boy who once practiced letters at my table. "Morning, Aunt Sheila," he said, stepping inside with a bouquet of sunflowers and a warm paper bag. "What's this?" I asked, smiling. "Croissants from that French place you mentioned," he said. "Thought we'd be adventurous." I laughed. Adventurous feels right these days. As we sat down with coffee and breakfast, Wesley reached for a manila envelope he'd brought with him. "I have some news," he said, his tone serious but bright with anticipation. "It's about Tobias." My stomach tightened out of habit. Even with the restraining order in place, Tobias still lingered in my thoughts like distant thunder, something I no longer saw, but half expected to hear again. "What kind of news?" I asked carefully. Wesley opened the envelope and slid a document onto the table. "He's filed for bankruptcy, personal and business. It's all gone." I stared at the pages, letting the words sink in. Everything. The house, the company, all of it. "After the divorce, he made a series of terrible decisions," Wesley continued. "Without your careful management and without the hidden funds he'd been relying on, he couldn't keep the business running or support his lifestyle." His voice was neutral, but I caught a quiet sense of closure beneath it. "He also tried to claim the support payments were impossible to meet," Wesley added, "but the judge rejected that. The settlement stands." I took a sip of my coffee, surprised by my own reaction. I'd expected to feel triumphant. Instead, I felt something closer to sadness. Tobias had spent so much energy trying to control me that he never learned how to build something solid for himself. "What happens to him now?" I asked. Wesley shrugged. "That's no longer our concern. His bankruptcy attorneys will deal with what's left. The important thing is this: he can't come back and he can't reopen anything." Relief washed over me, deep and complete. For months, I'd been bracing for another disruption. Now, that chapter was truly finished. "There's one more thing," Wesley said, his tone softening. "I wanted to talk to you about a scholarship fund." I raised an eyebrow. "A scholarship fund?" He smiled. "The one we could start with part of your settlement if you want to." He pulled out another set of papers, filled with careful notes and projections. "I've been thinking about everything you did for me," he said, "and everything my mom went through trying to give me opportunities that didn't exist for us. There are kids out there right now, bright, capable kids who just don't have access." I leaned in, drawn by the purpose in his voice. "I want to create a scholarship for children of domestic workers, immigrants, and single mothers," he said. "Not just tuition everything they need to succeed. And I want to name it after my mom, the Carmen Morales Scholarship Fund. My eyes filled instantly. Carmen would have loved that her quiet strength turned into something that lifted others. How much would it take? I asked. To fully support 5 students a year through 4-year degrees, Wesley said. About $100,000 to start, then $50,000 a year to sustain it. 6 months ago, that number would have felt impossible. Now, it didn't. Yes, I said without hesitation. Absolutely. Wesley's face lit up. You're sure? I thought of Carmen, of her dignity, of the love she poured into raising her son with so little support. I thought of the woman I had become since leaving that courthouse, the confidence I found when I stopped apologizing for existing. Carmen believed in investing in people, I said softly. She invested her love in you, and look what grew from that. I invested in your education, and you used it to change my life. Now we get to give others that same chance. Wesley reached across the table and squeezed my hand. You know what this means, right? I smiled. That I'm going to be busy. He laughed. Committees, interviews, mentoring. You're about to start a whole new career. The word career sent a spark through me. At 63, I was about to begin work that mattered, work I could see, feel, and celebrate. I think I'd like that, I said. After Wesley left, I spent the evening in my garden, pulling weeds and planting autumn flowers. The work was grounding, familiar, but different now. Every improvement was for me. As the sun dipped low, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, watching neighborhood kids ride their bikes. A young couple passed by with a toddler-easy laughter, shared responsibility, real partnership. It made me think about the woman I'd been for 41 years. She wasn't weak. She was loving, loyal, generous, but she had been afraid, always shrinking, always careful, always trying to be less so someone else could feel more. I took a deep breath, feeling the evening air fill my lungs. That woman did her best to survive. This woman was finally ready to live. The woman sitting on this porch was not the same woman who once lived in fear of taking up space. She still carried all the kindness and warmth of the old Sheila, but now there was something new inside her, an unshakable understanding of her own worth. She had learned that kindness doesn't require self-erasure, that love should never come with conditions, and that helping others is most powerful when it comes from strength, not obligation. My phone buzzed with a message from Wesley. He wrote that we should speak with a lawyer about officially setting up the scholarship fund and asked if we could meet this week to go over the details. He also suggested a small ceremony to announce it properly. Carmen deserved to be honored. I replied immediately, "Yes to everything. I'm proud of the man you've become, and I know your mother would be too." His answer came back just as fast. "And I'm proud of the woman you've become. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." I set my phone aside and looked out at my garden. The flowers Carmen had taught me to grow were blooming in colors she would have loved. The roses we planted together at the old house were probably still blooming too, but they belonged to a chapter that was closed now. These flowers were mine. They grew in soil I chose, cared for by hands that finally belonged entirely to me. They were beautiful not because anyone approved of them, but because they existed purely for joy. As evening settled in and the streetlights flickered on, a realization came over me, one that would have surprised the woman I used to be. I wasn't lonely. After spending most of my life defining myself in relation to others, as a wife, a mother, a supporter, I had discovered something unexpected. I genuinely enjoyed my own company. I liked who I was when no one was watching, when no one needed anything from me, when I could simply exist without explanation or apology. I liked my strength. I liked my kindness. I liked my quiet determination to build something meaningful from what had once been broken. The night air was cool and calm, filled with crickets and distant laughter from neighbors enjoying their own evenings. I wrapped a soft shawl around my shoulders and sank deeper into my chair, in no hurry to go inside. Tomorrow would bring plans and purpose, scholarship applications, interviews, meetings, celebrations, the busy, meaningful work of a woman who had finally found her calling. But tonight was just this piece. Sitting on my own porch, surrounded by a garden I planted and a life rebuilt with determination and the love of people who had never called me nobody. I lifted my glass in a quiet toast to Carmen, wherever she was, thanking her for raising a son who remembered the woman who believed in him when it mattered most. Then I toasted the sunset, the flowers, and the quiet miracle of a life that turned out better than I ever dared to imagine. At 63, I was finally exactly where I belonged, in a story where I was the heroine, not a background character. And the most beautiful part was this: it was only the beginning. I learned that loyalty can be painfully expensive when it's given to the wrong person, but choosing yourself after decades of choosing everyone else is worth every cost. Some endings are really beginnings in disguise, some losses turn out to be the greatest gifts, and sometimes the people who try to make you feel like nobody end up teaching you exactly how to become somebody worth knowing. I finished my wine as the last light faded, then went inside to plan tomorrow's adventures. There were so many possibilities ahead, and for the first time in my life, they all belonged to me. Now I'm curious about you. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever lived through something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, check out the 2 stories on the final screen. Both are channel favorites, and I promise they'll surprise you.